Imagine discovering the person you always considered cold and calculating was actually harboring the most devastating secret of your life. This is the story of Richard Montgomery, a 35-year-old millionaire lawyer, who, on a rainy Tuesday night, witnessed a scene that would forever change his perception of his family. Richard always had a distant relationship with Eleanor, his stepmother. It wasn't hostility, but it wasn't affection either. Eleanor had entered the Montgomery family's life just 3 months after the mysterious death of Margaret, Richard's mother, when he was only 12 years old. For 23 years, Eleanor maintained a reserved, almost cold demeanor, fulfilling her duties as the wife of Richard's father, but never attempting to take on the role of a mother. The Montgomery mansion stood in an upscale neighborhood of New York City, its meticulously manicured gardens and imposing architecture reflecting the family's success. It was a house that breathed tradition and wealth, but also held silences that seemed to echo through its marble halls. Richard had grown up in those luxurious rooms, but always felt something was missing, as if there were gaps in the family conversations that no one dared to fill. Augustus Montgomery, Richard's father, had built a pharmaceutical empire valued at over $200 million. He was a tall man with an imposing presence, impeccably groomed grey hair, and piercing blue eyes that revealed a sharp business acumen. Augustus was known in the business world for his discretion and strategy, but also for a melancholy that seemed to cling to him like a constant shadow since Margaret's death. Montgomery Pharmaceuticals specialized in medications for rare diseases, a niche Augustus had chosen seemingly out of nowhere in the 90s. Many questioned this specific business decision, especially considering how meteoric the company's growth was in a relatively short period. Augustus never spoke about the company's early years, always deflecting when anyone inquired about the exact origins of his fortune. He was a reserved man, guarding secrets about his business trajectory as if they were classified documents. His longest-serving employees whispered in the hallways about how the boss had drastically changed after the death of his first wife, becoming more focused on work, more distant from people, as if he were channeling all his grief into financial achievements. When Augustus died 6 months ago from sudden and unexpected cardiac complications, he left behind a seemingly clear and straightforward will. 60% of the inheritance to Richard, 30% to Eleanor, and 10% to charities specializing in research on rare diseases. The family lawyer, Dr. Edmund Carter, a trusted man who had known the Montgomerys for decades, had presented the document without question, as if it were the natural will of a devoted father. But on that rainy Tuesday night, Richard would discover that nothing in his life was what it seemed. It was one of those New York nights when the sky unleashed a deluge, turning the streets into rivers and creating that melancholic atmosphere that seems to invite the deepest thoughts. Richard drove his Mercedes-Benz along the flooded avenues, the wipers working incessantly against the torrential rain. He was returning from a work meeting that had run late. As a partner in one of New York City's most prestigious law firms, Richard was known for his dedication to complex cases, especially those involving inheritances and family disputes. It's ironic to think that he spent his days uncovering other families' secrets without imagining that his own family harbored even deeper mysteries. Richard had unexpectedly returned to the family mansion to retrieve some important documents he had forgotten in his old personal library. They were contracts related to a sensitive case that he needed to review before a hearing the following day. Eleanor had mentioned during Sunday lunch that she would be traveling to Westchester County to visit her younger sister, who was going through marital problems. It was a trip she made regularly, always showing that more human and affectionate side that she reserved for the family she had formed before marrying Augustus. The Montgomery estate, with its 10,000 square feet, should have been completely empty that night. The household staff had Tuesday off, and the caretaker lived in a separate house at the back of the property, rarely being seen after 6 p.m. It was the kind of silence Richard had known well since childhood, the silence of large houses, where every step echoes and every noise takes on dramatic proportions. Using the side entrance, that glass door leading to the conservatory that he always used when he wanted to sneak into the house. During his adolescence, Richard inserted his key and entered silently. His footsteps on the Italian marble made a soft and familiar sound, like a nostalgic melody from his childhood. The house smelled faintly of the lavender scent Eleanor always sprayed in the rooms, mixed with the aroma of the fine wood of the antique furniture Augustus collected. Richard climbed the carpeted stairs towards the second floor, where his old personal library was located. It was a room he had set up while still in college, with mahogany shelves filled with law books, classic literature, and some first editions he had received as gifts from his father over the years. There was also a collection of personal items, trophies from high school tennis competitions, family photographs from international trips, and an antique globe that Augustus had brought back from a trip to Europe. It was as he was climbing the last step of the staircase that Richard heard the first strange noises. They were muffled sounds coming from the direction of his father's main library, that imposing room on the ground floor that Augustus had designed as his personal sanctuary. Augustus's library was a magnificent room, with bookshelves that reached the ceiling, a natural stone fireplace, genuine leather armchairs, and a jacaranda wood desk that had belonged to Richard's grandfather. Driven by curiosity and a premonition he couldn't explain, Richard quietly descended the stairs and cautiously approached the library. Each step was calculated to avoid making noise on the wooden floor, which, knowing intimately since childhood, he knew exactly where it creaked. It was a skill he had developed as a child, to eavesdrop on adults' conversations or to borrow books from his father's library without being discovered. The library door was ajar, a sliver of golden light escaping into the dark hallway. Richard could hear it. Clearly now, the sound of paper tearing, mixed with what sounded like muffled sobs. His heart pounded, a mixture of adrenaline and confusion seizing his senses. What he saw through the crack in the door left him completely paralyzed, as if time had stopped and he was observing a scene from another world, a parallel reality that made no sense. Eleanor was kneeling on the Persian rug of the library, in front of the fireplace, which blazed with orange flames. Her hands trembled as she fed the fire with pages of documents. Richard recognized them instantly, pages written in his father's distinctive handwriting, that elegant, slanted script Augustus had developed through years of practice drafting business contracts. Eleanor wasn't just burning document, she was completely emotionally shattered, crying in a way Richard had never witnessed. These weren't discreet or controlled tears, like she usually displayed in moments of sadness. These were deep, desperate sobs, seeming to erupt from the depths of her soul. Her entire body shook, and she held each page with an almost religious reverence before surrendering it to the flames. But what shocked Richard most wasn't the burning documents, nor even Eleanor's despair. It was the words she whispered through her tears, words that reached his ears like fragments of a confession that should never have been heard. "Forgive me, Margaret," Eleanor whispered to the flames. "I promised I would protect him, but maybe he deserves to know the truth." Richard felt his blood run cold. Why was Eleanor speaking to his deceased mother? Why was she asking for forgiveness? He can never know how hard it was for you, Eleanor continued, her voice choked with emotion. He can never know that you chose to leave this way to protect him from the pain. Richard's hands began to tremble. What was Eleanor talking about? What choice had his mother made? Augustus made me promise to burn everything if Richard started to suspect anything before he turned 40, Eleanor continued, throwing more pages into the fire. He said that's what you wanted, that you wanted him to have a normal life, without carrying the weight of the truth. Richard had to lean against the hallway wall. His mind was struggling to process words that seemed to come from an alternate universe. What truth? What weight? And why was there a specific date for revelations? Eleanor picked up another stack of papers and before throwing them into the fire, kissed them gently. I will fulfill it to the end, my dearest friend. I will protect Richard as you asked, even if it means he never knows how much you loved him, how much we all sacrificed for him. Eleanor's tears now fell onto the documents before they were consumed by the flames, as if each page carried a piece of her soul with it. Richard could see that she was burning page after page of documents, some with notary seals, others with signatures he recognized, and many with his father's handwriting mixed with other scripts he couldn't identify from a distance. The entire scene had a ritualistic, almost sacred air. Eleanor wasn't simply destroying documents out of anger or revenge. She was fulfilling some kind of pact, some solemn promise she had made years ago. Each page was treated with respect before being given to the fire, as if it were a farewell ceremony. Richard remained hidden for almost half an hour, watching this surreal scene that defied everything he thought he knew about his family. The woman he had always considered cold and controlled was completely vulnerable, exposing a pain she had kept secret for decades. It was like watching someone shatter from the inside, piece by piece, page by page. When Eleanor finally threw the last pages into the fire and rose from the floor, her legs trembled so much that she had to lean against the bookshelf. She stood there for several long minutes, watching the flames consume the last vestiges of the documents, as if she were saying goodbye to a fundamental part of herself. It's done, Margaret, she whispered to the fire. Your secrets are safe. Richard can continue living without knowing, at least for 5 more years. Eleanor wiped away her tears with the back of her hand, took several deep breaths as if composing herself, and walked towards the library door. Richard barely had time to hide behind a marble column before she passed him in the hallway. She slowly climbed the stairs, each step seeming to carry the weight of decades of kept secrets. Richard heard the door of the master bedroom close upstairs, followed by a silence that seemed even heavier than before. For several minutes, Richard remained motionless, trying to process what he had witnessed. His rational mind, trained as a lawyer, tried to organize the information like pieces of a complex puzzle. Eleanor knew secrets about his mother's death. There was some kind of pact between Eleanor, his father, and possibly his mother. There were important documents that needed to be destroyed, and there was a specific date, 40 years, that held special significance. When he finally managed to move, Richard silently entered the library. The air was still warm from the fireplace and smelled of burnt paper mixed with the woodsy fragrance of the room. His hands trembled as he approached the fireplace, where some embers still glowed among the ashes. Using a fire poker, Richard managed to separate some fragments of paper that had not been completely consumed by the fire. They were small pieces, but enough to read some words and phrases that would completely shatter his world. On one of the fragments, he recognized his father's handwriting, moral debt that must be paid to Eleanor Montgomery for services rendered to the family during. On another piece of paper, half burnt, it read, Secrets that must remain buried to protect Richard Augustus Montgomery until he turns 40 years old. But the fragment that shocked him most contained a reference that stopped his heart. The true cause of Marina Elizabeth Montgomery's death must not be revealed to her son under any circumstances. Richard had to sit in one of the leather armchairs to avoid falling. His mother had not died the way he had always believed. There was something about her death that was being hidden, something so significant that documents needed to be burned to keep the secret, his hands still trembling. Richard continued examining the fragments of paper. He found a note in the margin of a document, written in his mother's hand, a script he knew well from childhood. Birthday cards and lunchbox notes. Eleanor must protect Richard at all costs, even if it means lying to him for the rest of his life. The most disturbing discovery was on a larger fragment, containing what appeared to be a specific instruction written in his father's hand. If Richard discovers the truth before he turns 40, Eleanor Montgomery must do everything to shield him from the reality, even if it means destroying all evidence and documents related to the true cause of Margaret's death. The child must not bear this burden. Richard carefully placed all the fragments in an envelope, turned off the lights in the library, and slipped out of the mansion like a ghost. During the entire drive back to his apartment, his mind raced with unanswered questions. How did his mother really die? Why was Eleanor involved in the family secrets? What happened that was so terrible it needed to be hidden until he turned 40? That night, Richard couldn't sleep a wink. He sat on his balcony, looking out at the city lights, trying to reorganize 23 years of family memories based on this jarring new information. Every childhood memory now seemed to have a hidden layer of meaning he hadn't noticed before. If you're enjoying this incredible story and want to know what Richard discovered upon further investigation, hit that like button now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any shocking revelations. And tell me in the comments, have you ever uncovered a family secret that changed everything? Let's continue this story that will leave you speechless. The next morning, Richard made a decision that would change his life forever. He discreetly hired Marcus Silver, a highly regarded private investigator specializing in complex family cases. Marcus had an impeccable reputation in New York City's legal circles, known for his absolute discretion and ability to uncover truths families preferred to keep buried. Richard provided Marcus with all the paper fragments he'd recovered from the fireplace, along with a detailed list of questions about the family history. He wanted to know everything: how Eleanor had met the family, the exact circumstances of Margaret's death, why his father had remarried so quickly after being widowed, and what the true contents of the original will were. Marcus was a man in his 50s, a former NYPD detective who had opened his own investigative agency after decades of experience in criminal cases. He had an unremarkable appearance that helped him go unnoticed, always slightly disheveled grey hair, and a meticulous work style that had solved hundreds of seemingly impossible cases. Marcus's initial investigation focused on hospital records and official documents related to Margaret Montgomery's death. What he uncovered in the first few days was already shocking enough to justify the family secrets, but it was only the tip of a much deeper and more disturbing iceberg. Margaret Montgomery had not died in a car accident on the Hutchinson River Parkway, as stated in the police report and death certificate. That information was true only on paper. Marcus's investigation revealed that Margaret had been hospitalized at a highly exclusive private clinic in the Upper East Side for the 3 months prior to her death, information that had never appeared in any official document. The clinic, called the St. Raphael Institute, specialized in palliative care and treatments for terminal illnesses. Marcus discovered that Margaret had been diagnosed with glioblastoma multiforme, an extremely aggressive type of brain tumor with an invariably fatal prognosis. The diagnosis had been made when Richard was 11 and a half, and doctors estimated she had between 6 months and a year to live. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. Eleanor Christina Silva, who at the time was not yet Eleanor Montgomery, wasn't simply a nurse who met the family by chance. She had been specifically hired by Augustus Montgomery to be Margaret's private nurse during her home-based palliative care. Eleanor had a nursing degree from Columbia University, with a specialization in oncology and previous experience in top hospitals in the city. She had been recommended by the St. Raphael Institute's medical team as one of the most competent and compassionate professionals in the area to care for terminally ill patients in a home setting. Eleanor's employment contract, which Marcus accessed through contacts in the private healthcare system, specified that she was to provide comprehensive medical care for Margaret Montgomery at her residence, maintaining absolute secrecy about the patient's diagnosis and prognosis. The salary offered by Augustus was 3 times the market value for this type of service, a clear indication of how much he valued the nurse's discretion. During the 3 months Eleanor cared for Margaret at the Montgomery mansion, something extraordinary and unexpected happened. The 2 women, who began with a purely professional relationship, developed a deep and genuine friendship that completely transcended the medical circumstances. Marcus discovered that Margaret had specifically requested that Richard never know about her illness. She wanted her son to remember her as the healthy and vibrant mother he had always known, not as a woman wasting away in a hospital bed. It was a decision that might seem selfish at first glance, but which in fact demonstrated a protective maternal love that placed her son's emotional well-being above her own need for a proper farewell. Eleanor became not only Margaret's nurse, but her confidant, her closest friend, and eventually her accomplice in a plan that would defy all moral and legal conventions. During the long nights when Margaret suffered from the pain of the tumor, the 2 women talked about life, about Richard's future, about the fears and hopes surrounding imminent death. It was during one of these nighttime conversations, approximately 2 weeks before Margaret's death, that she made Eleanor 3 requests that would change the course of both their lives forever. The first request seemed simple on the surface. Margaret wanted Eleanor to take care of Richard as if he were her own son after her death, not as a replacement. Margaret made that perfectly clear, but as someone who would watch over his well-being, guide him when needed, be present at the important moments in his life. The second request was more complex, laden with psychological implications. Margaret didn't want Richard to know about her illness until he turned 40. She believed that discovering the truth while still young would harm him emotionally, potentially affecting his life choices and relationships. Margaret wanted her son to have the freedom to fully live his youth and early adulthood without carrying the weight of knowing his mother had suffered in silence. But it was the third request that truly shocked Eleanor, and which explained why documents needed to be burned decades later. Margaret asked Eleanor to marry Augustus after her death, not out of romantic love, but to keep the family structure intact and ensure that Richard grew up in a stable and loving environment. Margaret had realized that Augustus was utterly devastated by her illness. He had become obsessed with finding experimental treatments, spending fortunes on consultations with international specialists, refusing to accept the terminal prognosis. Margaret knew that after her death, Augustus would spiral into a depression that could severely affect his ability to properly care for Richard. Eleanor initially resisted the third request. She had developed a genuine fondness for Margaret, and felt that marrying the widower would be a betrayal of her friend's memory. But Margaret was persuasive. She argued that Eleanor was the only person she completely trusted to care for both Richard and Augustus during the grieving period. The conversation that sealed everyone's fate took place on a particularly difficult night, when Margaret was experiencing a crisis of intense pain that medication couldn't adequately control. Through tears and moments of lucidity between waves of pain, Margaret revealed to Eleanor the most shocking plan of all. She didn't want to die wasting away in a bed. She didn't want Richard to eventually discover her sick, hooked up to machines, unrecognizable from the disease. Margaret wanted to control the circumstances of her own death, and she needed Eleanor's help to execute this plan. Margaret's plan was technically assisted suicide, although she never used those words. She had discreetly accumulated a lethal quantity of pain medication, saving extra pills throughout the weeks of treatment. Her intention was to take this controlled overdose at home, in her own bed, and then Eleanor would stage a car accident. Eleanor was horrified by the initial suggestion. As a healthcare professional, she had taken the Hippocratic oath to preserve life. As a practicing Christian, she believed that only God should decide the time of death, and as a human being, she had become genuinely friendly with Margaret and didn't want to participate in her death. But Margaret was persistent in her arguments. She explained that she was already dying. The overdose would only accelerate a process that was already underway. She argued that dying at home, in peace, surrounded by Eleanor's love, would be infinitely more dignified than slowly wasting away until her organs failed one by one. And, most importantly, she emphasized that this staged death would protect Richard from the terrible truth about her illness. For 3 consecutive nights, the two women debated the moral, practical, and emotional aspects of the plan. Eleanor discreetly consulted some colleagues about ethical issues related to palliative care, without revealing the specific details of the situation. She also spent hours in prayer, seeking spiritual guidance for a decision that defied all her personal convictions. It was Margaret who finally convinced Eleanor with an argument that touched the nurse's heart. "You are the only person in the world I trust to do this out of love, not out of despair. You are the only one who can ensure that my son will remember me as I was, not as this disease transformed me." The execution of the plan happened on a Friday night, exactly 3 months after Eleanor had started working as the Montgomery family nurse. Augustus was traveling on business in Washington, D.C., a trip that Margaret had specifically encouraged so that he wouldn't be present. Richard was spending the weekend at a schoolmate's house, as had become common in recent months when Margaret felt particularly weak. Margaret spent the entire day organizing personal details. She wrote letters to Richard, one for each birthday, until he turned 40, in which she expressed her love, offered motherly advice, and shared special memories she wanted him to keep. She also prepared a farewell video that should only be shown to Richard when he discovered the truth about her death. In the video, Margaret explained her motivations for choosing to die this way, apologized for lying about the circumstances of her death, and thanked Eleanor in advance for the sacrifice she knew the nurse would be making by agreeing to participate in the plan. She also expressed her hope that eventually Richard could understand and forgive the decisions that were made out of love. Around 10 p.m. that Friday night, Margaret took the overdose of medication in her own bed, holding Eleanor's hand and repeating words of gratitude and love. Eleanor stayed by her side until she was sure she had passed peacefully, and then began the most difficult part of the plan. She dressed Margaret in normal clothes, a blue blouse that was one of her favorites, and comfortable jeans she wore on casual days. Then, with a strength she didn't know she possessed, Eleanor carried Margaret's body to the garage and placed her in the driver's seat of the Mercedes-Benz sedan that Margaret used to drive. Eleanor drove the car to a specific section of the New York State Thruway that Margaret had chosen during the planning. It was a curve known for accidents, surrounded by trees, far enough from home to not raise suspicion about why Margaret would be driving in that direction. With meticulous care, Eleanor positioned the car so that it appeared that Margaret had lost control on the curve and collided with a tree. She discreetly broke the windshield glass from the inside out, creating the appearance of impact. She also made some superficial scratches on Margaret's face and arms to simulate injuries consistent with such an accident. Before leaving the scene, Eleanor whispered a final prayer for Margaret and promised to fulfill all her requests. Then, she walked to the nearest gas station and called the police, reporting that she had witnessed an accident on the highway, and it looked serious. Eleanor stayed at the gas station until the authorities arrived, and then offered to assist in the victim identification process, introducing herself as a nurse who had happened upon the scene and wanted to help. Her medical background lent credibility to her presence, and her apparent professional competence prevented anyone from questioning her version of events. The medical examiner's report concluded that Margaret Montgomery had died from internal injuries consistent with a high-speed car accident. The overdose of medication in her system was interpreted as pain medication she was taking due to injuries from the accident, not as the actual cause of death. Augustus was completely devastated by his wife's loss. Eleanor remained close to the family during the mourning period, initially just fulfilling her professional role as a nurse, but gradually taking on more household responsibilities as Augustus struggled with depression and Richard tried to process the loss of his mother. It was 3 months after Margaret's death that Eleanor finally revealed to Augustus the truth about his wife's terminal illness and the plan they had executed together. The revelation was devastating for Augustus, who initially reacted with anger and accusations, but eventually understood that Eleanor had sacrificed her own peace of mind to fulfill Margaret's last wishes. Augustus begged Eleanor to marry him, not out of romantic love, but to honor Margaret's memory and ensure that Richard had a mother figure in his life. Eleanor initially resisted, but eventually accepted when she realized that Augustus was falling into such a deep depression that his ability to care for Richard was being compromised. Augustus and Eleanor's wedding was a simple and discreet ceremony, held at the courthouse with only a few witnesses present. To the outside world, it looked like a romance that had blossomed during the mourning period. To Richard, who was only 12 years old at the time and was processing his own grief over the loss of his mother, Eleanor simply became part of the family. This revelation is heartbreaking, isn't it? If you want to support emotional stories like this and help me continue bringing quality content, consider sending a super thanks. Any amount is very welcome and motivates me a lot to research and tell these incredible stories. Your contribution makes all the difference in keeping this channel alive. But the most shocking truth was yet to be revealed through Marcus Silva's investigation. Eleanor had never married Augustus out of romantic love. It was an act of pure compassion and the fulfillment of a sacred promise made to the woman who became her best friend in the last months of her life. For 23 long years, Eleanor played a role that was simultaneously genuine and acted. She loved Richard as if he were her own son, but always had to moderate this demonstration of affection so as not to disrespect Margaret's memory. Every gesture of coldness, every moment of emotional distance was actually an act of love and respect for the promise she had made to the biological mother. Eleanor developed a sophisticated psychological technique to deal with this complex situation. She created emotional compartments in her own mind. In one compartment, she was the professional nurse who had cared for Margaret with competence and compassion. In another, she was the friend who had promised to protect Richard. And in a third, she was the wife who was trying to help Augustus rebuild his life after the tragedy. What nobody knew, not even Augustus, was that Eleanor kept a detailed diary of all these years. She wrote almost daily about her internal struggles, about how difficult it was to love Richard from a distance, about how she observed every milestone of his growth with a maternal pride she couldn't fully express. In the diary, discovered by Marcus in a safety deposit box that Eleanor kept at a bank, different from the one used by the Montgomery family, she described the pain of being seen as the cold stepmother, when in fact her heart overflowed with love for the boy who had become a man under her indirect care. Eleanor wrote about how she stayed awake on nights when Richard was sick, even when he was already a teenager and an adult, worrying about his health but unable to show that concern openly. She noted every professional achievement of his, every romantic relationship, every moment of joy or sadness, always watching from afar, always silently cheering for his happiness. The diary also revealed that Eleanor had never had a romantic relationship with anyone other than Augustus, and even the relationship with him was more a partnership of convenience and fulfillment of promises than a loving marriage. She had sacrificed any possibility of finding a true love of her own to keep the promise she made to Margaret. But perhaps the most touching revelation of the diary was the description of how Eleanor secretly celebrated Richard's birthdays. Every year on his birthday, she would visit Margaret's grave, bring fresh flowers, and whisper updates on how Richard was growing, his achievements, his difficulties, his dreams. It was as if she kept Margaret informed about her son's development, fulfilling her promise to take care of him even after his mother's death. Augustus's original will, which Eleanor had burned in the library on that rainy night, contained revelations that explained why the documents needed to be destroyed. Marcus managed to partially reconstruct the content of the will through backups that Augustus had left with other lawyers and banking contacts. The original will not only revealed the whole truth about Margaret's staged death, but also formally recognized the extraordinary sacrifice Eleanor had made for the family. In recognition of 23 years of silent dedication, Augustus had left 70% of his fortune to Eleanor, not the 30% of the official will. Augustus's logic was clear. Richard was young, professionally successful, and would have many opportunities to build his own wealth. Eleanor, on the other hand, had sacrificed decades of her life, giving up her own happiness and possibilities of genuine relationships to keep a promise. She deserved to be generously rewarded for that sacrifice. Eleanor, faithful to the end to the promise she made to Margaret, had secretly altered the will so that Richard would inherit the majority of the estate. She did this not out of modesty, but because she believed that Margaret would have wanted it that way. She never wanted the money. She had never married Augustus for financial gain, and she wouldn't start benefiting materially from the sacrifices decades later. Marcus's investigation also revealed that Eleanor had never touched a single cent of the monthly inheritance she received. All the money was being automatically deposited into a separate savings account she had opened in Richard's name. For 23 years, she had lived exclusively on a small nurse's pension she had saved from previous jobs and a modest allowance that Augustus insisted on giving her for personal expenses. When Marcus presented all these discoveries to Richard, the emotional impact was devastating. Richard needed to take a week off from the law firm to process information that completely redefined his understanding of his family and himself. The most disturbing discovery for Richard wasn't even The revelation about his mother's staged death, but the understanding that Eleanor had spent 23 years loving him as a son while he treated her with coldness and distance. He realized how many moments of maternal affection he had missed by not understanding the complex situation Eleanor found herself in. Richard remembered dozens of small gestures Eleanor had made over the years that he had interpreted as obligation or even manipulation. She always knew exactly what his favorite food was and made sure it was available when he visited the house. She never forgot important dates like graduations, professional promotions, or serious relationships. She always asked about his health in a way that seemed casual, but which he now realized was genuinely concerned. Eleanor had also been discreetly responsible for many opportunities Richard had received throughout his life. She knew people in the medical and legal fields through her professional nursing network and had discreetly recommended Richard for internships, jobs, and even important clients, always without taking credit or even mentioning her participation. The most touching revelation was discovering that Eleanor had saved absolutely everything related to Richard's life. Newspaper clippings when his name appeared in legal publications, photographs she discreetly took during family events, copies of his diplomas and certificates, even drawings and essays from school that Augustus had thrown away, but which she had discreetly retrieved. All these items were organized in chronological albums that Eleanor kept in her room, like a proud mother documenting her son's life. But she had never shown these albums to anyone. They were her private way of celebrating the boy she had helped raise, even from a distance. Folks, this story is giving me goosebumps. Eleanor sacrificed 23 years of her life out of love. If you're also moved by this revelation, share this video with someone special and leave in the comments what you would do in Richard's place. This story deserves to be known by more people. Armed with this devastating truth, Richard made the most difficult decision of his adult life. He needed to confront Eleanor, but he didn't know how to approach such a delicate and emotionally charged situation. How do you confront someone who sacrificed their entire life for you, especially when you spent decades treating that person with coldness? Richard spent several days carefully planning this conversation. He knew Eleanor would be devastated to discover that the secrets had been revealed prematurely. She had burned the will specifically to prevent him from knowing the truth before he turned 40, as Margaret had requested. Now, 5 years before the stipulated deadline, all the secrets were exposed. It was on a Friday night that Richard finally mustered the courage to have this conversation that would forever change their relationship. He arrived at the Montgomery mansion unannounced, using his key as he had done on that fateful night when he discovered Eleanor burning documents in the library. The house was silent, with only a few lights on downstairs. Richard found Eleanor exactly where he expected, in the library, sitting in the same leather armchair where Augustus used to read, staring intently at the fireplace that was now extinguished and cold. It was as if she were reliving that traumatic night when she had destroyed the last vestiges of family secrets. Eleanor was wearing a simple cotton robe and slippers, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, looking older and more fragile than Richard had ever noticed before. There was a melancholic quality to her posture, as if she were carrying the weight of decades of secrets kept and promises fulfilled. "Eleanor," Richard said softly, announcing his presence. She turned slowly, and Richard saw in her eyes a complex mixture of emotions: relief, terror, resignation, and perhaps a little hope. It was as if she instinctively knew that this moment would come sooner or later, and a part of her was grateful to finally be able to stop carrying the secrets alone. "You shouldn't be here, Richard," she said in a tired voice, but without surprise. "Especially not in this room. There are too many memories here." "Eleanor," "I know everything," Richard said, his own voice choked with the emotion he had been suppressing for weeks. Eleanor's face instantly crumbled. She covered her face with her hands and began to cry, not the silent, controlled tears he was used to seeing, but deep, desperate sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. "You shouldn't know," she managed to say between tears. "Margaret said you should only know when you turned 40. She wanted to protect you from the pain. She wanted you to have a normal youth without carrying the weight of the truth about how she died." "Why did you do it?" Richard asked, sitting in the armchair next to her. For the first time in decades, he was seeing Eleanor not as the cold and distant stepmother, but as a woman who had sacrificed her entire life for a promise. "Why did you sacrifice your entire life for a promise made to someone who wasn't even your family?" Eleanor wiped away the tears with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself. But the emotions continued to overflow. "Because your mother asked me," she said with devastating simplicity. "And because I love you like a son, Richard. I always have. Ever since you were a 12-year-old boy, trying to be too strong for your age." This confession opened the emotional floodgates. Both of them had kept sealed for decades. What followed was a conversation lasting over 4 hours, during which Eleanor recounted the entire story from the beginning. How she had met Margaret, how they had become friends, how Margaret had planned her own death, and how Eleanor had spent 23 years keeping a promise that had cost her own happiness. Eleanor spoke of the nights she lay awake worrying when Richard was sick, even when he was grown. She described how she secretly celebrated his professional achievements, how she rooted for him in his love life, how she suffered when he was struggling, but couldn't offer the maternal support her heart yearned to give. "I so desperately wanted to be a real mother to you," Eleanor confessed, tears streaming freely down her face. "But I promised Margaret I would never try to take her place. So I loved you from a distance. I cheered for you in silence. I cared for you in the only way I could, by keeping the secrets she wanted protected." Richard listened silently, absorbing information that completely reshaped his understanding of his childhood and adolescence. Every family memory now had a new layer of meaning. Eleanor hadn't been cold or distant out of lack of affection, but out of an excess of respect for Margaret's memory. "The will you burned," Richard managed to say when Eleanor finished her account. "Left almost the entire inheritance to you," Eleanor finished, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "Your father recognized that I had sacrificed my life to keep the promises I made to your mother, but I didn't." "Want the money, Richard? I never did. I just wanted to keep my promise to Margaret and protect you from the pain of knowing she had chosen to die that way." "But why did you alter the will? Why didn't you accept what Dad wanted to give you?" Richard asked, genuinely confused. Eleanor smiled sadly. "Because that's what Margaret would have wanted. She always said you were the future, that you had a whole life ahead of you to build, to conquer, to be happy. I had already lived my life, not in the way I imagined when I was young, but in a way that had meaning. Taking care of you, even from a distance, was the most important thing I ever did." Richard rose from the armchair, and for the first time in decades, embraced Eleanor with genuine filial affection. It was a hug that carried 23 years of misunderstandings, of repressed affection, of love that had existed, but could never be fully expressed. "Eleanor," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "you're not my stepmother. You are my mother, and you always have been, even when I couldn't see it." They cried together there in the library, surrounded by the ghosts of secrets that had finally been revealed. Richard understood that he had been loved in a way few children could comprehend, by two extraordinary mothers, each willing to sacrifice everything for his well-being. Margaret had sacrificed the opportunity to properly say goodbye to her son, to protect him from the pain of watching her die slowly. Eleanor had sacrificed 23 years of her own happiness to honor that choice and ensure Richard grew up in a stable and loving environment. The next day, Richard insisted that Eleanor sign a new will, dividing the inheritance equally between them. "It's not about the money," he explained. "It's about recognizing the sacrifice you made. It's about you finally getting the credit you deserve for being an extraordinary mother." But for Eleanor, the most important reward wasn't financial. It was finally being able to openly express the maternal love she had held in her heart for decades. For the first time in 23 years, she could embrace Richard without reservation. She could show concern when he was ill. She could openly celebrate his professional achievements. Eleanor also revealed that all these years she had kept the letters Margaret had written to Richard, one for each birthday until he turned 40. The letters were in a safety deposit box, awaiting the right moment to be delivered. Each letter contained maternal advice, special memories, and expressions of love that Margaret wanted to share with her son during the important milestones of his life. "He wanted to be present in your life, even after she was gone," Eleanor explained, handing Richard the first box of letters. "She wrote about your first romantic relationships, about your college graduation, about your legal career, about the man she hoped you would become." The letter from Richard's 35th birthday, which he opened in Eleanor's presence, contained not only the usual congratulations, but also a profound reflection by Margaret on the choices she had made at the end of her life. "My dearest Richard," the letter read in his mother's familiar handwriting, "if you are reading this, it means Eleanor has kept her promise to take care of you all these years. I hope you can understand and forgive the choices we made out of love. I chose to leave in that way, to spare you the pain of watching me wither away. Eleanor chose to sacrifice her own happiness to ensure you grew up knowing you were loved and protected." The letter continued, "I know it may be hard to accept that your childhood and youth were built on a well-intentioned lie, but I hope you see this lie for what it truly was, a manifestation of the purest and most protective love a mother can have for a son. I didn't lie to hurt you, but to protect you. And Eleanor didn't keep secrets to harm you, but to honor my memory and my last wishes." The most emotional discovery was a video that Margaret had recorded a few days before, carrying out her assisted death plan. In the video, recorded in the same library where Richard and Eleanor had their revelatory conversation, Margaret appeared visibly weakened by the disease, but still maintaining the elegance and strength of personality that Richard remembered from childhood. "My dear son," Margaret said in the video, looking directly into the camera, "if you are watching this, it means Eleanor has finally been able to tell the truth about our family. First, I want you to know that all the decisions we made were motivated by love, love for you, love for the family we wanted to preserve, love for the life we wanted you to have. I had two choices: to let you see me wither away slowly, losing my dignity, my identity, piece by piece, or to leave in a way that you could remember me as the strong, loving mother I always was." The most touching part of the video was when Margaret addressed Eleanor directly, even knowing she'd likely watch it with Richard decades later. "Eleanor, my dearest friend, if you're watching this beside Richard, it means you kept your promise. It means you sacrificed years of your life to care for my son. I have no words to express such generosity, such love." Margaret continued, addressing Richard this time. "Eleanor isn't just your stepmother, my son. She's a second mother who chose to love you unconditionally, even knowing that love would have to be expressed in a limited way because of the promises she made to me. She deserves your respect, your affection, and your recognition for the extraordinary sacrifice she made. The video ended with Margaret softly humming a lullaby she used to sing to Richard when he was little. It was a simple melody, but brimming with nostalgia and a maternal love that transcended death. After watching the video, Richard and Eleanor sat in silence for long minutes, processing decades of repressed emotions. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "Mom Margaret, Mom Eleanor, I had two extraordinary mothers, each loving me in the way she could, each making unimaginable sacrifices to ensure my happiness." In the following months, Richard and Eleanor completely rebuilt their relationship. For the first time, Eleanor felt free to openly express her maternal affection, and Richard could reciprocate with the filial affection he'd always felt but never known how to adequately demonstrate. They established new family rituals that honored both Margaret's memory and the reality of their present relationship. Every Sunday, they visited Margaret's grave together, bringing fresh flowers and sharing updates on Richard's life. It was as if they could finally include Margaret in the family conversations she'd missed due to her premature death. Eleanor also began sharing stories about Margaret that she'd kept for decades, how she planned Richard's education, what dreams she had for his professional future, what kind of woman she hoped he would choose as a wife. These were precious memories that helped Richard get to know aspects of his mother that premature death had interrupted. The Montgomery mansion underwent a significant transformation during this period of family reconstruction. The library, which had been the scene of so much secret suffering, was reorganized to include a memorial corner for Margaret. Eleanor and Richard placed their favorite photographs there, some of her personal jewelry, and a copy of the farewell video so they could watch it whenever. They felt the need to connect with her. What an incredible story of love and sacrifice, isn't it? Eleanor showed us that being a mother goes far beyond blood ties. It's about unconditional dedication, silent sacrifice, and protective love. If this story touched your heart like it touched mine, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and share it with someone who needs to hear about the power of true love. In the comments, tell me, what was the greatest proof of love someone ever gave you? And don't forget to activate notifications, because every week I bring emotional stories like this that will make you reflect on the true meaning of family and love. Thank you very much for watching, and see you in the next video. The most significant transformation in Eleanor's life was finally being able to live authentically. For 23 years, she had played a role that was simultaneously genuine and restrictive. Now, at 48, she could finally be the mother she had always been in her heart. Eleanor began attending social events with Richard, proudly introducing herself as mother instead of stepmother. She became actively involved in important decisions in his life, offering advice and emotional support that she had been forced to give discreetly for decades. Richard also made significant changes in his professional life in response to the family revelations. He began specializing in cases related to palliative care and the rights of terminally ill patients, inspired by his mother's story and Eleanor's sacrifice. His new specialization allowed him to help other families facing similar situations, transforming his personal pain into professional purpose. The relationship between Richard and Eleanor also changed his perspective on romantic relationships. He had spent years searching for a partner who could compete with his idealized memories of Margaret. Without realizing, that his expectations about love and sacrifice had been shaped by two extraordinary women who had made exceptional choices for love. Eleanor, for the first time in decades, began to consider the possibility of finding romantic companionship for herself. At 48, she realized she had kept her promises to Margaret and that she deserved to pursue her own happiness. Richard actively encouraged her in this pursuit, recognizing that she had sacrificed relationship opportunities. During the best years of her adult life, the revelation of family secrets also brought a deeper understanding of Augustus's behavior in the years after Margaret's death. Richard realized that his father had lived with the weight of guilt for having participated in the staging of his wife's death, and that his obsessive dedication to work had been a way of coping with the emotional trauma. Augustus had channeled his grief into the research and development of medications for rare diseases, specifically because he wanted to find treatments that could help other families avoid the kind of desperate choice Margaret had been forced to make. His company had become a leader in oncology research not because of financial ambition, but as a way to process his own loss and guilt. Eleanor revealed that Augustus had spent years in therapy to cope with the trauma of having helped stage his wife's death. He had considered many times telling Richard the truth, especially during his turbulent adolescence, but always backed down when he remembered Margaret's specific request to wait until he turned 40. The most touching discovery about Augustus was that he had also written letters to Richard, not birthday letters like Margaret, but letters explaining his motivations and asking for forgiveness for the necessary lies. These letters were in another safety deposit box, along with documents detailing all the medical research he'd funded in Margaret's memory. Augustus had quietly established a research foundation in Margaret's name, funding studies on glioblastoma multiforme and other aggressive brain tumors. The foundation had contributed to significant advancements in the treatment of these diseases, allowing other patients to have treatment options that Margaret never had. Richard decided to take the lead of the Margaret Montgomery Foundation after discovering its existence. It was a way to honor both his mother's memory and the silent work his father had done to transform personal tragedy into a benefit for other families facing similar situations. Eleanor also became actively involved in the foundation, using her experience as an oncology nurse to help develop home hospice care programs. Her personal experience with Margaret made her uniquely qualified to understand the needs of families dealing with terminal illnesses. 3 years after the revelation of the family secrets, the dynamics of the Montgomery family had been completely transformed. The house that previously housed dark secrets and distant relationships now resonates with open conversations, genuine displays of affection, and the certainty that true love sometimes requires extraordinary sacrifices. Eleanor could finally live as the mother she had always been in her heart. She decorated her room with photographs of Richard at all stages of life, created family albums that included both memories with Margaret and new moments with Richard, and established family traditions that celebrated both the past and the present. Richard, in turn, learned to appreciate not just one, but 2 extraordinary forms of maternal love. He now understood that Margaret had loved him so much that she chose to protect him from pain, even at the cost of losing the opportunity to say a proper goodbye. And Eleanor had loved him so much that she sacrificed 23 years of her own happiness to honor the wishes of a deceased friend. The story of the Montgomery family eventually became a source of inspiration for others facing complex family situations. Richard began giving lectures on ethics in palliative care, always emphasizing that true love sometimes requires difficult choices that may be misunderstood for years or decades. Eleanor became a consultant for families dealing with terminal illnesses, helping them navigate the emotional and ethical complexities involved in end-of-life care. Her unique experience made her especially qualified to understand both the patient's and the family's perspectives. The library of the Montgomery Mansion, which had been the scene of so much secret suffering, was transformed into a space of healing and memory. The walls now display photographs of the family in happy moments, including both old memories with Margaret and new moments of joy between Richard and Eleanor. The fireplace where Eleanor burned the secret documents is now used for cozy family nights, where mother and son share stories, make future plans, and celebrate the kind of genuine family relationship they had both desired for decades, but had never been able to fully express. The story of Richard Montgomery, Margaret Montgomery, and Eleanor Montgomery teaches us profound lessons about the complex nature of family love. It shows that sometimes the people who seem most distant are those who are making the greatest sacrifices for us. Eleanor spent 23 years being seen as the cold stepmother, when in reality she was a mother who loved so much that she was willing to suppress demonstrations of that love to honor the memory of those who came before. Margaret, even facing her own mortality, proved that a mother's love transcends physical life. She carefully planned how to protect her son from pain, even if it meant being remembered incompletely for decades. Her love was so great that she managed to organize her own continuity through Eleanor, and Richard learned that family is not just about blood ties or comfortable truths. It's about the people who choose to stay, who choose to sacrifice, who choose to love unconditionally, even when that love needs to remain partially silent for years. Today, Richard and Eleanor live as a real mother and son, united not by the secrets of the past, but by the understanding that true love sometimes demands the greatest sacrifices. Every time Richard looks at Eleanor, he sees not only the woman who took care of him for 23 years, but also a reflection of Margaret's eternal love, a love so great that it managed to ensure its own continuity even after death. The Montgomery Mansion no longer harbors dark secrets that need to be burned in the fireplace. Now it's a home where two people can finally love openly, knowing that this love was built on the strongest possible foundations, genuine sacrifice, fulfilled promises, and the certainty that some lies are told only to protect those we love most. Eleanor, at 51, finally discovered that fulfilling a promise of love may be the greatest reward anyone can receive in life. She not only honored Margaret's memory, but also discovered that maternal love does not require biological ties, only the willingness to love unconditionally, even when that love has to be expressed in unconventional ways. This is a story about how true love sometimes needs to hide in order to protect, about how appearances can be completely deceiving when the heart is doing everything possible to keep secrets that hurt, and about how, in the end, the truth always finds a way to heal, even when it hurts deeply in the process of revelation. Richard Montgomery learned that he had been blessed with two mothers who loved him unconditionally. Margaret, who carefully planned his protection even in death, and Eleanor, who lived that protection every day for 23 consecutive years. And perhaps this is the greatest legacy anyone can receive, knowing that they were loved so deeply that people were willing to sacrifice their own happiness to ensure their well-being. The Montgomery Library no longer echoes with the painful sound of important papers being burned in secret. Now it resonates with long and affectionate conversations between mother and son, with tears of joy instead of silent despair, and with the comforting certainty that some family secrets, when finally revealed at the right time, do not destroy families. They strengthen them in ways we never imagined possible. And so, a night that began with shock, disbelief, and the discovery of burning documents transformed into the greatest lesson of love Richard could ever receive. Sometimes, the people who love us most are those who learn to love us in silent respect, protecting our emotional hearts, even when it means breaking their own in the process of continuous protection. It was a profound understanding, a revelation born from the ashes of deception, a testament to the enduring power of unconditional love. The flames that consumed the papers, they also illuminated a truth far more precious than any secret. A truth whispered on the wind, carried on the rain-soaked streets of New York. A truth etched into the very stones of the Montgomery mansion, the weight of Eleanor's sacrifice, the depth of Augustus's unspoken devotion. It was all laid bare, finally unveiled in the heart of that chaotic night. The secrets burned, but the love remained, stronger, more resilient than any carefully constructed facade, than any carefully guarded illusion. Richard had faced betrayal, suspicion, and a shattering of his perception of reality. But in the aftermath, he found something far more valuable than answers. He found a love that had endured in silence, in sacrifice, a love that had been burning brightly all along, hidden beneath layers of protection, layers of secrets, but real. A love that had ultimately saved him. This night, this fire, this revelation, it changed everything.